of all of that, let's talk about Seth Weinberger. Seth has come to us several times before to talk to the World Affairs Council, but just so you know his background, he is a professor of politics and government at the University of Puget Sound. He received his BA in political philosophy from the University of Chicago, 1993. Do you want me to read the dates? No, that's okay. And then his MA in security studies from Georgetown University, an MA and PhD in political science from Duke University. He teaches courses on international relations, US foreign policy, international security, terrorism, constitutional law, and political philosophy. His book, Restoring the Balance, War Powers in an Age of Terror, was published by Prager Press in 2009. And he's recently published several articles. For example, Enemies Among Us, the targeted killing of American members of Al-Qaeda and the need for congressional leadership in Georgetown Global Security Studies Review. And his current research examines the uses of decentralized recruiting networks by organizations like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and in the US, the incels. You might want to explain what that is. And then in 2011 and 16, he was awarded the Thomas A. Davis Teaching Excellence Award. So please let us welcome Professor Weinberger. Now we're gonna trade the ear thing. And then afterwards, we'll take some questions when he's done. We'll do a little moderated discussion when Seth is finished. You have to kind of squeeze it into your ear.
There we go. Okay, how's that? That seem about right? Everyone can hear me? I mean, a little weird, but okay. All right. Well, thank you all very, very much for coming tonight. Thank you for the invitation. It is always a pleasure to speak to people who are dedicated to not only keeping up and continuing to learn about the world, but to understand it. And apropos of Nina's comments before, thank you all for staying up so late. So tonight I'm going to talk about two ongoing wars, the war in Ukraine, which we have up on our map, up on our slide right now, as well as the war in Gaza. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how I understand the connections between these two, right? So I'm not going to just give you a sort of recap of what's happening, but I study war and sort of why war happens and how war changes. And I'm going to talk about what I think we sort of learn about war in these two conflicts that helps us understand why they are unfolding the way they are. So that's sort of where I'm going to go. I will tell you that I'm a really old school sort of traditionalist teacher. I don't use slides or video stuff in my class. So my slides are all completely out of order because I didn't really think about it until today. So I'm going to move around between them. So, and they're not great. There's not any words on them or anything like that. I don't really like doing this, but I figured given that I'm talking about war, I should at least have maps of what's going on. So, and then I guess so. If you have, I'm always happy to take sort of explanatory questions if there's something that I say that you don't understand, or you have sort of a factual question. Fine to ask those while I'm talking, but I guess we're going to have a Q&A session afterwards. So if you have a more substantive question, maybe we'll hold those until the end. Okay. So we have two significant ongoing conflicts in the international system today. We have, as we see on the slide, on the screens, we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine that started on February 24th, 2022. Now I have to go. And then we also have what I'm going to now call sort of the Greater Arab-Israeli War, which started on October 7th, 2023, when Hamas sort of burst out of the Gaza Strip and attacked Israeli villages and settlements in Kibbutzim and the techno dance party that is now expanding into Lebanon. Right? So there we have Lebanon, and I'll come back and talk about these in more detail as we get there, as well as at some point, there's going to be some sort of attack against Iran, right? Israel's going to retaliate for the missile strike of 2 weeks ago. And so it's no longer, I think, just a war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. It is expanding. And I'm happy to talk about that in questions or about the West Bank or anything like that. Right? So I think at first glance, these wars, I think I keep hitting this and moving it. These wars seem like they have little to do with each other, right? On the one hand, we have something that looks like a sort of what we would call a kind of traditional land war in Ukraine, right? A war fought between two states that have armies and they're meeting on battlefields, right? And they're conducting what looks like sort of old school traditional war. And then you have the war in Gaza, which looks very different, right? You have the war of a highly technological, highly efficient military fighting a insurgent terrorist group embedded in the population, right? And that war looks very different, right? So on the face, these wars look like they're two totally different things, but I don't think that's actually right. Okay? I think they share similar features that has contributed to the reason why both of these wars are so terrible. And they're terrible in distinct but related ways. Right? And terrible in ways, I mean, war is always terrible, right? It always involves lots of death and lots of misery. But these wars in particular have turned out to be particularly terrifying and horrible. Right? Okay, so I'm going to start with sort of the current, talk a little bit briefly about the current state of both of these wars, where they look like they're going. Talk a little, then I'm going to come back to, I think, the main sort of theme, which is what is it that connects these wars? What do we learn about warfare, sort of where the state of warfare is from these wars, and how does that explain how and why they're unfolding the way that they are? And sort of why they are as brutal as they are, why they're involving so many civilian casualties. In both places, right, we're seeing targeting, or at least what looks like the targeting of civilians, right? And so I'm going to explain, I think, a little bit of why that's happening. And then that's also going to help us understand why they are so difficult to win, right? The Ukraine war is now stretching on into its almost coming up on its 3rd year soon. The Gaza war, well, it depends exactly when you measure from these, right? But at least from October 7th, right now, we're already over a year. And Israel seems to be making some progress, but I don't think anybody really thinks it's going to end anytime soon. Okay. All right, so I think most people would sort of characterize the Russian invasion of Ukraine as what we would refer to as a war of attrition, or in maybe layman's terms, a meat grinder kind of war, right? It is involving immense amount of casualties, right? Currently, Russia is this one, slowly advancing in what's known as the Donbass. The Donbass is the eastern part of Ukraine, which is populated by people who often speak Russian and would often identify themselves as Russian, if not Russian and Ukrainian. And you can see, so all these maps come from, I'll just give you come from the Institute for the Study of War, which in my opinion, if you're trying to keep up with sort of beyond the news, if you want to understand the war and what is actually happening on the ground in really great levels of detail, ISW is the best website. They're really, really good at this, and they produce these amazing maps. And they sort of have day-by-day breakdowns of what's going on. So just a plug for that, right? So on this map, let's see in here, did that work? I have to hold it. No, do we see a laser pointing there? Can't, my map is too red. The laser doesn't work on it. There it is, but all right, oh well. Okay, so you can see these areas with this map is a couple of days old, but things are moving pretty slowly, so it's still fine, right? The areas that are circled in green are areas where the Russians are beginning to move forward, continuing to move forward, right? And what it looks like is what we think Russia is trying to do. The initial hope, Russia, was to take the entire state, bring down the Ukrainian government, and turn Ukraine into some sort of Russian fiefdom. That plan went out the window for reasons I will explain very quickly. And what's happening now is Russia is trying to sort of creep forward in this area, the Donbass. Okay, we'll see if that one works. Do I have to do anything? Oh, that one's better. Okay. Right. So those areas, the green, right? The areas where the Russians are starting to advance, these green circles. Oh, over here now. Right. In order to basically, hopefully, I think, get to a point where they can declare that they have won because they have liberated and protected these populations of sort of quasi-Russians who are Ukrainian, but again, speak Russian and sort of, at least Russia claims are really Russian. Right? We also have, right, Ukraine holding a small part of Russian territory, right? About a month and a half ago now, the Ukrainians launched a surprise attack across the Russian border. Too many things. Right. Into this area. So this area that is blue, has the blue stripes, is the area that the Ukrainians are currently controlling. Right? They launched a thrust across the Russian border to seize a chunk of Russian territory in the Kursk Oblast. Oblast kind of means province or region, right? And so you can see this, right? And so the Ukrainians are holding on to this territory. So now each side is controlling some of the other side's territory. And so that's sort of where things are. Russia is sort of inching forward in the Donbass, or the previous slide, and Ukraine is holding on to this territory, and the Russians are now trying to push them out. That's what's going on there. In the greater Arab-Israeli war, right? The operational tempo has slowed down from what it was, right? So after the October 7th attacks of last year, Israel has started to pound Gaza in an attempt to destroy and uproot Hamas, the governing organization, also a sort of insurgent terrorist group. The operational tempo has slowed down. As of June 19th, there had been reported 37,400 deaths. As of October 4th, that had been gone up to 42,500, right? So Israel is now slowing down and going to more sort of targeted operations, right? One of those is what resulted in the killing of Yahya Sinwar, the military leader of Hamas, actually now also the political leader after they killed Mohammed Dayef a few months ago. So Israel's now moving away from dropping huge bombs and tanks and things like that and switching to more targeted raids because they've already cleaned out so much of Hamas's territory. Right? So the war sort of slowing down a little bit there, but still going on. I'll talk more about Sinwar later. And then we also have the ongoing military operations in Lebanon. Right? On October 7th, after the Hamas attack across the Gaza Strip into Israel, Hezbollah, which is a Shiite organization, a Shia Muslim organization that is sort of a resistance militia / terrorist group based in Lebanon. But it's complicated. It's also sort of often part of the Lebanese government. It's one of the leading political parties in Lebanon. So it's a complicated situation, which I can talk about. But Hezbollah started launching rockets into northern Israel in support of Hamas. And that ended up in the evacuation of approximately about 100,000 Israelis from the north. And that situation was becoming increasingly untenable. And so a few weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago now, after the pager operation that ended up killing significant parts of the Hezbollah leadership and then the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, Israel started a military operation. And I left my laser pointer back over there, right, again. So, right, military operations here in the blue zones, you can see are the areas that Israel currently is occupying with troops. All of these little dots scattered across the map are villages that Israel has ordered the Lebanese civilians to evacuate. And everyone is supposed to evacuate up to, you can see that river. So it's a river, it's a line on our map, right? But they're ordering, so all these people down here are supposed to evacuate up north of this river here, which is the Awali River. Okay? And so Israel is conducting relatively small military operations, right? So they've sort of occupied this pretty narrow zone down on the south. and then they're conducting targeted raids and strikes against Hezbollah forces and missile depots and weapon supplies and things like that. Okay, and then Iran, right? We don't know what's going to happen with Iran. Israel is preparing to strike at Iran in retaliation for the 200 ballistic missiles that were launched at Israel a week and a half ago. The United States has been trying to sort of rein Israel back in, doesn't want this to turn into a broader regional war. The United States just announced that it was going to send what's called a THAAD system. A THAAD system is a ballistic missile defense system, along with 100 US troops to Israel. And it looks like that was done in exchange for Israel promising not to attack either Iranian nuclear facilities or oil production facilities. So Israel has said that it's only going to attack military facilities. That attack hasn't happened yet. Hopefully, I think the hope here is that Israel can attack in a way that shows their military capability to Iran, but doesn't force Iran to have to escalate or retaliate on its own, right? And the US is trying to manage this conflict, but we don't know. So, but that will be coming, I would expect, soon. Okay. I'm not going to talk about what's going on in the West Bank, although that's, I think, part of this. But if people are interested during the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about what's happening in the West Bank as well. Okay. So what connects these two wars, right? I promised you that there's something that actually holds these two wars together, that helps us understand what's going on both in both of these wars, but also in the state of war more generally. So what is it? What we see in these two wars is what I'm going to refer to sort of simplistically as a defensive advantage. Right? When we study war, political scientists talk about something called the offense-defense balance, right? Which is the way we measure sort of the efficacy of actual military operations, right? And to simplify this, you can think of two armies that are exactly the same meet on the battlefield, right? They have exactly the same number of soldiers with exactly the same training and exactly the same weapons, right? Clone armies meet. Who's going to win, the side that's attacking or the side that's defending? Right? And at any particular moment in time, the military technology that these two sides have tends to favor one side or the other, either offense or defense. Right? And at various moments in time, that balance shifts back and forth. So there have been times in history where offense has had the advantage and it's better to be attacking. And there are times in history where defense has had the advantage and it's better to be defending. And I'll just give you an example of what this means. Right. The Battle of the Somme in World War I was a battle between largely the British and the Germans that lasted from June 24th to November 13th, 1916. And on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British lost 57,000 soldiers. I mean, that's absolutely insane to think about, right? 57,000 soldiers on the first day. Across the entire, 5.5 months of that battle, the combined militaries of the Germans and the British lost about 1.5 million soldiers. And the British won, and I'm putting air quotes here, because winning meant they took 8.5 miles of territory. Right? So in 5.5 months of war, at a cost of 1.5 million casualties, you could advance 8 miles. Right? That's a war where defense has the advantage. Right? And if we think about World War I, almost everybody who has seen any kind of movie about World War I or knows anything about World War I, that the defining characteristic of World War I was trenches, right? So there were a couple of relatively new technologies that had been invented, largely barbed wire and machine guns, right? And soldiers quickly figured out that if you dug a trench and sat in that trench and strung up barbed wire and put a machine gun there, you could just annihilate the enemy forces when they came at you. And that's what happened in World War I. So World War I was a defensive war, right, in which it took immense amount of casualties to advance very, very small distances, right? 1.5 million casualties for 8.5 miles. In World War II, though, the balance had changed, right? And again, if you know anything about World War II, the thing that most people associate with World War II is blitzkrieg, right? in which the Nazis had figured out that if you combined air power with tanks, right, you could move really, really quickly and take huge amounts of territory at very low cost, right? So as opposed to the Battle of the Somme, in the Battle of France, right, the Germans lost 185,000 troops and seized the entire country in 6 weeks. Right? So World War I was a defensive war in which the sides expended huge amounts of blood to not do very much. And World War II, at least in the beginning, was an offensive war, right? In which the Germans figured out that they could move really quickly and they could take over all of Europe with relatively low casualties. Okay? And this is a gross oversimplification, but it's enough for our purposes tonight. So as technology has advanced over time, war has become increasingly more lethal for civilians. Why? So if you think about, let's say, Civil War movies, right? The Civil War is where most people sort of would put the break between sort of old school war and modern war. If you think about Civil War movies, how did they fight? They would line up, right? And they would walk at each other, and then eventually they'd start poking each other with bayonets, right? And they did that because the weapons they were using were so inaccurate and had such low ranges that they couldn't really fight at distance. So they would start, but then they would close the distance and they would end up fighting hand to hand, right? You can't fight that way anymore because machine guns and artillery and all these things are way too accurate. So soldiers on battlefields have increasingly dispersed, right? They have spread out, right? As opposed to, tight formations like in the Civil War, soldiers now spread out over huge distances. And this is all going somewhere, right? So in the Civil War era, we talk about something called troop density, which is how many troops are there basically per square mile, right? In the Civil War, there were 10,500 troops per square mile, right? Because the troops would line up right? They would pack themselves in because that's how you overwhelm the enemy, right? You needed more soldiers in that group that would walk forward and overwhelm the other side. But in World War I, actually, I don't have numbers for World War I, sorry. By World War II, it's down to 95 soldiers per square mile because the soldiers are spreading out, right? And again, if you've seen World War II movies, you think about, those, platoons moving through forest where they're all strung out, right? Because if they're close together, artillery is too accurate and planes are too accurate. They're dropping bombs and snipers and all that. So you have to spread out to protect yourself. During the Cold War in Europe, they were down to 52 soldiers per square mile. And now on the Ukrainian front, it's estimated to be about 20 soldiers per square mile. Okay. Now, why does this matter? Well, if you are the adversary and your enemy is all spread out, how are you going to attack your enemy? Can't find them. So what do? You attack civilians. You attack civilians. Right? So as war has become increasingly difficult to kill soldiers, states conducting military operations have increasingly attacked non-combatant targets, civilians, right? And so war has increasingly moved off of discrete battlefields, right? So if you've been to the Gettysburg battlefield, right? It's in the middle of nowhere. Right? Civil War battlefields were out in the middle of nowhere. Where were the battles of World War II fought? Where are the battles of the Ukrainian war being fought? In the cities, right? Where is Hamas, right? In civilian populations, right? So what happens is as war spreads, as the war becomes more accurate and lethal, soldiers protect themselves by spreading out, and then the other side responds by targeting civilians. So war has become increasingly lethal to civilians. During the Civil War, only approximately between 5 and 8 and 10% of the total casualties were civilians. In World War II, 75% of the casualties were civilians. So war has become increasingly lethal to civilians, right? Even as it has become more sort of deadly and accurate, right? Okay. So the problem is, though, that countries often misread this offense-defense balance, right? And so when Russia started the Ukraine war, they clearly thought this war was going to be over in 2 weeks, right? They were very sloppy. They were sort of trying to rush to get Kyiv. And even more so, if you understand that a war is going to be defensive, the war might not actually make sense, right? If people had known what World War I was going to look like, you don't go to war because you can't win anything, right? 1.5 million casualties for 8 miles doesn't make any sense, right? If Russia had known what the Ukraine war was going to look like, what we now know it is, they might not go to war at all because they can't win, and they're not winning, right? So both sides, I think, in this war misread the balance. Russia thought that they would be able to roll over the Ukrainians, that they had a massive offensive advantage, and they didn't. But who misread the balance in the Gaza war? It actually wasn't Israel, it was Hamas. Hamas thought that they had so effectively embedded themselves in the Palestinian population that Israel would not be able to come after them, right? Because they assumed that Israel wouldn't be willing, well, let's be blunt, to kill as many civilians as would be required to do what would be necessary. They thought that international pressure would reign in Israel. They thought whatever they thought, right? So Hamas, I think, right, misreads the balance and thinks that it can defend itself by embedding itself in the civilian population, which will make Israel unwilling, well, to do what it has done, okay? Why did Russia misread the balance? Well, I believe Russia overestimated the competency of its own soldiers. I believe the Russians overestimated the efficacy of their weapons. And I think that they grossly underestimated the willingness of the Western alliance to supply the Ukrainians with weapons, right? If you go back all the way in time to the beginning of this war, February 2022, the Europeans were incredibly dependent on Russian energy. The United States had just withdrawn from Afghanistan and perhaps looked weak. And the Russians suspected, I think, that the West wasn't going to risk potential war, right? Why did Hamas misread the balance? Well, there are few things more difficult than a military fighting in a city, especially a military that is trying to adhere to the laws of war and minimize civilian casualties, right? Urban conflict is incredibly dangerous for your own troops, right? Trying to fight among a civilian population in buildings that are easily defendable is very, very difficult. So I believe that Hamas thought that first Israel wouldn't invade the Gaza Strip in the way that it did because it would be concerned about the safety of the hostages that Hamas took. I believe that Israel wouldn't be willing to, I think Hamas believed that Israel wouldn't be willing to kill as many civilians as it would take, and that international pressure would reign in Israel. And I also think it's possible that Hamas sort of maybe over-succeeded on October 7th, that they didn't quite understand how brutal and bloody their attack would be and how many people they would kill, and that they sort of thought that it was going to be a smaller operation in which they would end up with some hostages that would lead Israel to have to negotiate with them, or maybe smaller scale attacks. But for whatever reason, I think Hamas misread the balance. They thought that their defensive advantage would protect them, and it has not. Okay, so how does all this matter? So when we think about warfare, this is sort of a very simple model from an Air Force colonel about the way in which war operates, right? The purpose of war is to achieve a political outcome by applying force against a country's political leadership, right? The center ring, right? Ultimately, in order to win a war, unless you completely conquer the other side, which almost never happens, you need the political leadership of the other side to give up and give you what you want, right? The problem is the political leadership is embedded behind all these other things. You can't just get to the political leadership, right? You usually have to fight your way through the other side's military, right? And then once you get through the military, then there's the population, the infrastructure, system essentials, which are sort of critical infrastructure things. And then eventually there's the political leadership, right? But the problem that I've just said is that you can't actually often find the military, or it's ineffective to attack the military. So Russia's having this problem, right, where it's losing 1,000 soldiers a day. Russia is currently losing 1,000 soldiers a day to advance a few meters, right? And it's doing this day after day after day. The United States and the British intelligence estimate that so far, in a little over 2 years, Russia has lost 600,000 soldiers. Just staggering amounts, right? And they have not been able to achieve their goals, right? They haven't even really conquered all of the Donbass yet, right? And so if the Russians can't destroy the Ukrainian military, what are they going to do? They're going to start shooting rockets and missiles at the population. Is this still working? Yeah. Right? And the infrastructure. And so the Ukrainian war has largely turned into a meat grinder on the front, but then behind the lines in the Ukrainian depth in the country, right? What is Russia attacking? Energy structures, dams, power plants, the energy grid, and the civilians, right? They're using drones literally to terrorize the Ukrainian civilian population. And the same thing is true in Israel, in Gaza, right? The Israelis have a hard time finding Hamas. They're embedded in the population. They're underground in these tunnels that they've been digging. So if you can't find them, all you can do again is attack the population and the infrastructure. Again, I think Hamas calculated that Israel would not be willing to do this, but they are, right? And so what we've seen in both of these wars, right, is that by misreading the offense-defense balance, how much that would protect them, right? So Russia thought it was offensive, right? Hamas thought that the defense would protect them. They both got it wrong and started wars that they, A, cannot really win. Sorry, point my laser in your eye. That they cannot really win, and B, that are incredibly brutal to civilian populations. Right? So just to, of all the missiles and the drones that the Russians have launched at the Ukrainians, American military intelligence estimates that only 3% have been aimed at military targets. 97% of these missile waves and drone attacks and rockets that the Russians are shooting into Ukraine are aimed at apartment buildings, schools, cultural centers, power plants, banks, infrastructure, system essentials, and population. Because if you can't successfully kill the Ukrainian military, the way you put pressure on the leadership is by attacking those other rings. And the same thing is true in Gaza, where I think so far we're somewhere around 41,000 Palestinian deaths. There are some estimates that it's maybe as high as 150,000, but it's hard to get an accurate count because the war is going on. Right? 85 to 90% of the population of the West Bank has been displaced out of their homes, right, living in refugee camps. Approximately 50% of the buildings in the Gaza Strip have been destroyed. In the north, it's about 70, 75%, right? 50% of the tree crops, 42% of the greenhouses, right? And we've, of course, seen strikes on refugee camps and hospitals and schools, right? So again, incredibly devastating to the Palestinian civilians, most of whom have nothing to do with Hamas, right? And what has this resulted in? Well, Israel estimates it's killed approximately 17 to 19,000 Hamas fighters, which would be about half of Hamas's strength before the war started, right? They've killed the entire Hamas leadership at this point, but Hamas still exists as an organization, right? In fact, it's rebuilding itself back in the north. So if you've been following the news, you know that Israel is preparing to restart operations in northern Gaza, right? Because they can't quite root out the organization. It's very hard to root an organization out that is embedded in the population, right? And so what we're seeing then is these wars, right, where the only way to fight, or at least the only way that actors believe they can fight, is by targeting civilian populations, right? Which is incredibly distressing and incredibly horrific. Back up in Lebanon, you have the same thing. And so if we go back to the Lebanon map, right, Hezbollah had done the same thing that Hamas did. It embeds itself in villages, right? You might remember just 2 days ago, right? The UN accused Israel of shooting at UN positions. Why? Because Hezbollah bases itself right next to the UN positions, right? These organizations are trying to create a defensive advantage by embedding themselves in targets that they're hoping the Israelis won't go after. Well, the Israelis are going to go after them. And so you can see, right? I mean, that 50, 60, 100 villages Israel has ordered evacuated. Lebanon has a population of 5.1 million. Right now, the estimates are somewhere around 1 to 1.5 million people are being displaced, right? That's 20% of the population, 20 to 25% of the population has already been displaced, right? So again, war has become increasingly horrific and brutal to civilian populations, right? And this is a product, again, of the accuracy and the efficacy of modern war making it very, very difficult, right, to actually target soldiers, right? So war becomes more lethal for soldiers. Soldiers diffuse and defend themselves. So other sides have to increasingly target civilians, right? And I think that's really what sort of holds these wars together, even though they're incredibly distinct in ways, right? Okay, so why is all this happening? Well, first, I think we're really seeing the impact of sort of the modern technological revolution, right? Drones, cheap computers, cheap satellite technology, artificial intelligence, right? The Ukrainians, the Russians can now build drones for $100, $200, right? You can go down to the equivalent of your Best Buy, buy a drone, stick a camera on it, stick a gun on it, stick a bomb in its claw, and anybody can learn how to fly this thing over. And so what that has done, it has transformed a military. The Ukrainian military was relatively poorly armed when this war started, right? It now has essentially the equivalent of constant satellite surveillance, but it's not getting surveillance through satellites. It gets them through drones that cost a couple of $100, right? You can use a $200 drone to destroy a $30 million tank, right? Which has been very effective. And the Russians are starting to figure this out too, right? And so, again, this has made war very, very damaging to the troops, right? Hamas builds its rockets, the rockets that it shoots at Israel, it builds those out of sewer pipes and fertilizer, incredibly cheap, right? And so as the cost of war gets lower, right, as it becomes easier for actors to get significant kinds of military capabilities, that transforms war in a really powerful way, right? The Ukrainians, which have the population, I think the population of Russia right now is somewhere around 145 million. The Ukrainian population is around 40 million, right? And yet the Ukrainians can mobilize almost equivalent amounts of military power as the Russians, right? Making it almost impossible for the Russians to accomplish their goal, right? Hamas, a force of 40,000 troops, soldiers, right, can build rockets out of pipes and fertilizer, hide in basements, hide in tunnels, and stymie, I mean, again, I think they're losing, but it's taking a long time, stymie the most technologically sophisticated military in the world. So the sort of the decreasing cost of war is one factor that drives this. But the other thing that I think is incredibly distressing is this sense that adversaries are increasingly seeing the benefits of embedding themselves in civilian populations. That is incredibly problematic, right? Not just from a war perspective, and in fact, maybe least from a war perspective, but from a humanitarian perspective, right? Other actors, groups resisting authoritarian regimes, or groups attacking democratic regimes, right? As groups increasingly see the difficulty that states have dealing with forces that are embedded in civilian populations, more and more actors are going to do this, right? And they're going to hope that public opinion or a state's morality or that their soldiers aren't going to be willing to do the kind of stuff that Israel did, right? And that is a very, very distressing direction for war to go in, right? And again, this has been a trend that has been going on really since the end of the Civil War. War has been becoming increasingly moving off of the battlefield and into into cities and into the civilian populations. And I think that what you're going to see from both of these wars is that that is going to increase even more, that future war, right, which is less and less defined between states, right? If US and China fight someplace down the road over Taiwan or whatever, that's going to look like a kind of traditional war, right? But that's not what most war is anymore. Most wars are ethnic conflicts or rebel groups or insurgent groups or terrorist groups fighting against states. And increasingly, those groups are going to see the benefits of either embedding themselves in populations to defend themselves or attacking populations because they can't attack and they can't successfully compete with the militaries of states. And that is a very, very dangerous direction for war, right? Those of us who study war do so because we want to prevent it. There is nothing more horrible in the world than war, right? And unfortunately, it's getting, I think that at least the effects of war are getting worse. So I will stop there. And I'm happy to take questions about what I spoke about, or if you just have sort of broader questions about what's going on in either of those situations, or as I mentioned, I'm happy to talk about the West Bank or what's going on with Iran or any of that. So anything sort of related or even tangentially related, I am happy to talk about, but I will stop there for now. Pleasant. My students often complain how unpleasant my classes are. So, but this is the stuff that we've got to talk about.
Unpleasant classes. We have a microphone that I can take around the room. And I was going to ask you maybe a technical question.
Sure.
Could you describe the difference between essential facilities and infrastructure?
Yeah, unfortunately, the guy who created this thing didn't actually do that.
Oh, sorry. Was it like internet access, maybe?
Yeah, so infrastructure would mean things more like roads and water facilities and things like that. And system essentials, I think they're talking about things like communication grids and stuff like that. I think the guy's name who did this was Colonel John Warden. These are called Warden's rings. And he never actually defined what he thought the difference was. And I keep thinking I should take those terms out because someone always asks what that difference is, and I never know how to answer that question.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I mean, so the way in which I think that if you sort of think about this, right, the infrastructure would be, again, like I think it's like roads, airports and stuff like that. And then system essentials like the internet, cell towers, things that sort of underpin the infrastructure and that then connect the leadership to the infrastructure and the population, I think. But that's how I describe it. I don't know if that's correct.
Makes sense. And this is a great diagram. It really helps explain a lot. And
it's really important for understanding what the purpose of war is, right?
Pete has a question. Pete Falk, board member Pete Falk.
With the increasing attacks on civilians, it seems like an increasing mutual hatred on both sides. So where does it ever end?
Where does it end? Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I'm certainly not going to pretend to solve the Palestinian-Israel problem tonight, but I think I just hit something. Did I do that? Something just popped up. Oh, it's a question from someone. Okay. So where does it end? I mean, so politicians, I'll answer your question this way. Politicians tend to have relatively short time horizons, right? I need to solve the problem that I'm facing today or tomorrow, not the problem that I'm facing in a month or a year or 5 years, right? And this is one of the reasons it's so hard for politicians to deal with climate change, right? Because you'd rather deal with economic productivity today than economic collapse and environmental destruction, down the road, right? So if you think about Israel, for example, right, Israel has to solve the problem that presented itself on October 7th, which is to destroy Hamas, and they're not really worried about what comes next. Because for a variety of reasons, political leaders just, right, they have terms of office, right? They have to satisfy constituents. They have to, right? They're not going to be in power forever. So they're focused on the short term. And also because the short term is easier to sort of control and see, right? We can think about Hamas, but we don't really know what's going to happen in three months or a year or 5 years, right? So the first question is, and to some degree, this is why it continues, is that politicians aren't thinking down the road, right? I think people are trying to sort of put pressure on Israel right now to come up with something that resolves, at least starts to move towards some kind of long-term resolution of the Palestinian situation, right? But for a variety of reasons, which I'm happy to go into if you all are interested, that's unlikely to happen. So where does it end? It probably is not going to end anytime soon, right? That's why this conflict has been going on. I mean, you could start back in 1967, you could go back to 1948, you could go back even before that, right? The Russians and the Ukrainians goes back hundreds of years, right? I'm not a Russian. I know we have a Russian historian, I have someone who does Russian history in here, right? The relationships between the Russians and the Ukrainians go back hundreds and hundreds of years, right? And this argument that Putin makes that there is no such thing as Ukraine, that they're a made up people, that they don't exist. That's sort of how Russia thinks about itself hundreds of years, right? So these things don't end. They tend to stick around. One of the ways you actually solve this problem in other situations is by creating states, right? And because it tends to create stabilization because states are better able to defend themselves. So one thing that would help, again, not that you can get there, but if the Palestinians get a state, in theory, it might actually help resolve some of it, even though the enmity will still be there. That's probably not a great answer to your question, but that's the one you're going to get.
But that's the one he's going to get.
That's right.
And Seth, I do have a question from the internet, and
Sure.
then I'll bring it back around this side of the room. The question from our viewers online, which were about 15 people.
Oh, wow, great.
George Will wrote an article yesterday in which he said World War III is already underway. Not that Harris or Trump has noticed. What are your thoughts on George Will's views that World War III is already underway?
Yeah, I read that piece. I think it's overstated. I think it's overstated for a couple of reasons, right? First, World War III killed 80 to 100 million people, right? We're not even close to that. Excuse me, World War II. Right. Sorry, World War III has not killed 80 million. World War II killed somewhere between 80 and 100 million people, right? Depending on how you count, right? It was a cataclysm of unparalleled scope, right? What we have now are a series of regional conflicts that have some connectivity between them, but are relatively distinct and are relatively contained, right? In order for this to look something like World War III, I think what you would need to see in particular, the only place where most, I think, not everybody, but the only place where most people think you're likely to get a significant sort of traditional, massive, great power war would be the United States and China, perhaps over Taiwan, right? And China doesn't seem to be interested in that right now, I would argue. And so what I think would lead you to think that this were something similar or the opening phases of World War III, where if China were trying to take advantage of this, sort of, the United States is distracted, the U.S. Defense infrastructure is stretched, providing all these artillery shells and missiles and stuff for the Ukrainians, and distracted by Israel. And that would lead you, right, to think that there's something sort of big and large and systemic and global coming. Right now, what you have is a war in Ukraine that is draining what people thought was sort of the second or third most powerful military in the world, which is now revealed to be not pretty. I think we've learned that the Russian military is not the threat we thought it was, and they're bogged down. Right, Iran is in a position right now of incredible weakness. They have now launched a total of 500. So, right, there was the first sort of ballistic missile and drone attack in April. That was 280 missiles and drones. And then this one, 2 weeks ago, that was 200 missiles. So they've launched approximately 500 missiles and drones at Israel and killed a grand total of 2 Palestinians, or one Israeli Arab and 1 Palestinian. Right, so 500 missiles they've launched have killed nobody. They've really lost their ability to deter Israel. Their proxy in Hezbollah has been not wiped out, but their leadership has been killed, and Hezbollah is on the defensive. Hamas, right? So all of these sort of proxies that Iran has around the Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis are not able to really do anything. So Iran has, I think, right now in a position of extreme weakness. So that to me doesn't look like World War III. That looks like a series of distinct regional conflicts in which the adversaries are actually, I would argue, all in position. Now, being in a position of weakness doesn't mean you are in fact weak, right? States that are in positions of weakness actually get very aggressive because they want to defend themselves or change the situation, right? So I don't want to imply that this means it's all going to go swimmingly, but all of these actors, I think, are actually in positions of weakness, not positions of strength, where to get to the point of a global cataclysmic war, World War III, you need these actors to think they are in positions of strength and can actually sort of, engage, embark on global conquest or something like that. So I think he was overstated in that.
Thank you. I appreciate the fact that you think he was overstated. And I have Leslie and Howard online, but I have 2 questions here,
Okay.
3 questions here. So I'm going to take this gentleman first, and I could ask Bryn, can you turn off the PowerPoint
It's yours.
so we can,
I don't think I need it again.
so we can see Seth online
Oh, that's going to terrify me.
and turn off the PowerPoint, and I'll hand the mic over to this gentleman who has a question.
If I remember correctly, in order to get Ukraine to give up nuclear weapons, America signed an agreement.
And Russia.
Ukraine.
Well, so the U.S. didn't promise to protect Ukraine. They promised to sort of, I'm trying to remember the language. They promised to sort of respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. And the Russians signed that too, right? So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead, finish up.
Russians got the nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
But we do have sort of an obligation, I believe, to help Ukraine.
Mhm.
Not that I want to. I think we have an obligation.
Well, so I mean, that's correct, right? Well, so what the US signed was not like a defense alliance treaty like it has with NATO or Japan or South Korea. It was an agreement between the United States and Russia, and I don't know who else was in there, to respect Ukrainian autonomy in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. I think it is certainly fair to say that obviously the Russians didn't think that piece of paper was worth very much, and that perhaps the United States does have an obligation and is, I think, adhering or at least living up to that obligation. I don't think anybody thinks the United States is going to start sending troops into Ukraine. I think we can argue about whether or not Biden is being too deferential to the Russians and whether or not they should allow the Ukrainians to, conduct long-range strikes into Russian territory. I think that's a sort of an arguable point. But and I think the United States is doing what it was supposed to, right? I think the United States is defending Ukraine. I think without the United States, there's no other European country that could provide Ukraine with the amount and the quality of weapons that it would need to be able to resist. So, I mean, I don't want to minimize, those weapons wouldn't do anything if the Ukrainians weren't willing to fight for their country, but they also doesn't do much to fight for your country if you don't have any weapons. So, yeah, I mean, I think I would say the United States is helping to defend Ukraine in the way that it probably should. And, but yes, I mean, I don't think you're going to see any countries giving up their nuclear weapons anytime soon.
Wait a minute, we need to, wait, hold on for a second. We always have to put this into the microphone. What was your question? Again, the second part?
Yeah, I think that,
Everybody has forgotten the agreement between the United States, Russia,
and Ukraine. Yeah,
and Ukraine, saying Ukraine give up your nuclear
yeah, I
weapons.
mean, I think that's probably right.
I've got one more question in the back and one in the front and then a bunch online. So, speak into the mic.
Okay. The first thing I wanted to say is I don't know how you sleep at night, but you mentioned that your interest is in deterring war.
Sure, yeah.
And so I'd like you to elaborate what your thinking is about the ways that that can be accomplished.
Mhm.
Also, maybe you have some thoughts about the way in which war and the use of war affects political processes. Like I would say, one of the major concerns right now is that the war in Gaza is going to have an effect on our election.
Mhm.
So some of your
Okay.
thoughts.
All right, so two different questions, right? So what does it mean to sort of study war for the purpose of preventing it? Well, so the first thing I do is and I take this part of my job perhaps more seriously than anything else that I do. I train students to go out and work in this field, right? So I have students who work, former students who now work for the CIA, who work for the FBI, who work in the Department of Justice, who work in Congress, who work directly for the President of the United States. And I hope that if I've done my job well, I have taught them all how to how to make decisions. I think, right. So when I teach classes, I do two things. First, I want students to understand the material that I'm teaching them, whatever that is. If it's thinking about American foreign policy, if it's thinking about terrorism, whatever that is. But really what I'm doing is I'm preparing students for how to make decisions when all of the things you have to decide are terrible. Right? Because those decisions still have to be made, right? So no matter, and this is true even when you move outside the field of war, but almost every decision that you make harms somebody else in some way, right? Or comes at the expense of somebody else. And yet you still have to make those decisions and you have to understand why the decision you're making is right. So the first thing that I do is I take that job very seriously. I want to produce students who dedicate their lives to public service, and go out and work for the government or work for, I have students who become immigration lawyers or I'm just trying to think of all the incredible things my students do. And I want to be confident that they are going to do those jobs in thoughtful, careful ways in which they are weighing the consequences of their decisions, but understanding that those decisions have to be made, right? Then, of course, I also produce scholarship. And so I do work, one of the papers that was mentioned at the beginning, I did work on presidential war powers during the war on terror, and I was looking at things like the president's ability to use drone strikes to kill American citizens. And was writing about, so the paper I wrote ended up arguing that Congress needs to create a new sort of judicial process to do this. And, did that paper make a difference? I don't know. Who knows? But that's, what scholarship does is produce a body of knowledge that people build upon and that other people build upon and that people use. So I've had meetings with Congress people, and again, I get to talk to my student. I mean, this is the coolest thing ever. I have a student right now. My student's title is Special Assistant to the President of the United States. What his job is he takes President Biden's foreign policy and goes on to the Senate and talks to senators from both parties about Biden's foreign policy priorities, right? And his job is to get the senators right. So, and so I get to talk to the student about what that should look like. And so all those things, it's not that I think, nobody thinks that they're going to end war, but by training students to be better citizens, to be informed members of democratic communities, and to actually use the skills that they learn from me and my colleagues in their educations, that's what you want. You want people out there who are making good decisions. And so that's sort of how I think about doing that. Your second question, how does war, and I think specifically, how does war sort of affect maybe our current political process? No doubt, right? So, I think a big part, I don't know, you don't want to think that a president is making foreign policy decisions based on sort of narrow political calculations, but I also think it's naive to think that they don't think about those things. So I think the recent decision by President Biden to send the missile defense system to Israel, which I'm going to assume, I don't know this and don't quote me because I don't actually have any evidence of this, but I assume that missile system was sent in exchange for an Israeli agreement to not attack Iranian nuclear sites or oil production facilities. Well, I guess in the absence of that, if Israel did attack one of those things, a war with Iran would have a major impact on the domestic election, right? And again, while I don't like to think that politicians should make those decisions with, sort of naked political calculations in mind, I'm sure they do. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, candidate Harris has had a hard time, and I think she's done a decent job, maybe not as good as some people would like, but, she's been trying to stake out a slightly different position on Gaza than Biden has taken. The United States just publicly announced that if Israel doesn't allow more aid into the north, that arms transfers would cease in 30 days. Again, I think those are all things that you would expect anyway, but probably were made with an eye on the election.
Thank you, Seth. We're going to take another question here, and then I have several from the online audience and another over there. And you, Seth, could you repeat the question so our
Oh, sure.
folks can
Yeah.
hear it?
Sorry.
So my question may be too microscopic view for this conversation, but I'm curious. So when Israel's being able to quote unquote target Hamas, are they doing that because they have embedded spies, or are they turning the Palestinian and Lebanese people to share information back where these leaders are? If indeed we believe that they can accurately say, oh, we killed da 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 da, they have to have pretty accurate information, and I don't understand how they're getting that accurate information.
So I mean, yes, that's a very in the weeds kind of question, but that's fine.
You have to repeat it.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
That-
I'm sorry.
It can't hear that on the microphone?
Apparently not well enough.
So the question was, how does Israel sort of know who all the members of Hamas and Hezbollah are, and how do they know that they've killed them, right? How do they identify them? So there's a couple of answers to that. Yes, they have really good spies. Particularly in Gaza, though, the way they have done this is Israel has spent the last, I don't know, probably 10 years conducting facial recognition scans of everybody in Gaza, and they literally know who every member of Hamas is. And so like if you think about like England with its massive CCTV system, right? And so they sort of monitor everybody. Israel has basically done that in Gaza, so it literally knows who everybody is. And so that doesn't mean they know where everyone is at all times, but so when they're moving the population, that's why they can do it, right? You might have asked yourself, well, why doesn't Hamas just, hey, I'm not a Hamas member, I'm just going to move into the refugee camp? It's because Israel knows every member of Hamas because they've spent 10 years identifying all of them. And they've presumably done something very similar up in Lebanon. So it's a combination both of having spies, which they do have. Israel has one of the best intelligence services in the world, as we learned with that pager operation. But also they use technology in a way that most other actors cannot and do not. Sure.
Okay, I have a question from the Zoom audience about hearing more about the West Bank conflict and the significance of the Israeli war.
Okay, right. So does everyone sort of know what how much information I have to provide here? Do most people understand what the West Bank is and all that? Yeah. Is that safe to assume? Yes, no? Okay. All right. So the connection here is that, so I have an old friend who is a Israeli peace activist, lives in Israel. He's a peace activist, but he has very significant connections to, contacts in Hamas. He was the person who negotiated the prisoner hostage release. I don't remember when this was, but Ghalid Shalit, who was the Israeli soldier who was kidnapped by Hamas, was that maybe 10 years ago? And then Israel exchanged like 1,000 Palestinians, right? So this old friend of mine, he's the one who set that up. So he has connections and friendships of people in Hamas. So he thinks that right now with Sinwar, and this is going to get to the West Bank in a second, right? So he thinks that with Sinwar's death, there is an agreement on the table, or that is at least being discussed, that he thinks Sinwar would not have accepted because Sinwar was a fanatic. There is no way that Sinwar would ever agree to anything like a ceasefire. But now that he's dead, it is possible that whomever replaces him is some sort of moderate, right? Or moderate within Hamas, right? Not like, not real moderate, but a Hamas moderate, and would be willing to accept this deal. And the deal would be something like Hamas leaves Gaza, or at least agrees to have some sort of international governing and police force come into Gaza. The Israelis withdraw, hostages are released, and the prisoners are swapped. Okay. Now, in order for that to work, you need Saudi Arabia, right? Because Saudi Arabia is sort of the leader of the Muslim world, right? The Arab Muslim world. And Saudi Arabia would be the force that was most likely to be able to spend the amount of money that it's going to take to rebuild Gaza, as well as get the soldiers that you would need to police Gaza. Saudi Arabia, however, won't do this unless Israel commits to moving towards an eventual Palestinian state in the West Bank. And Israel is not there yet. Israel is not quite willing to do that. Right? So part of the problem in Israel is that the Israeli government has become I'm sorry, you read the question and it was on Zoom, so I don't need to repeat it, right? But the Israeli government has become sort of increasingly taken over by very extreme religious Jews who want eventually to sort of take over the West Bank. And Netanyahu depends on the support of those political parties to maintain power. And so right now you have this situation where most people sort of think that is, or something like I just mentioned, is really the only thing that's going to sort of resolve the conflict in Gaza. You're going to have to get some kind of pan-Arab peacekeeping force, governance, rebuilding, but that's going to require the Saudis, but the Saudis aren't going to do it until you get progress on the West Bank. Really, at least to some degree, the key in getting all this resolved is probably going to involve the West Bank. And it's not clear that Netanyahu is willing or able to do that because of the way that Israeli domestic politics work, the way that their government functions, and the demands of the Israeli right. So I don't know if that's really what they were asking, but
I believe so. And is Howard still on there? Does he have a question or not? Because I have a gentleman up here in a red jacket who does have a question. We'll get to Howard's hand raise if he wants a question.
I assume that there are academics in other advanced countries that are doing the same type of work that you are. Are you in contact with some of these groups and pooling your resources and trying to influence? Could you talk about that a little bit? Because I would assume that when a group of people get together with the right intentions, a lot of good things can happen if another people are at the table with the same intentions in mind.
So the question was sort of about the way in which academics collaborate and think about producing change. So my own research, so what I was talking about tonight is stuff that I sort of study, but it's not actually the work that I do. The work that I do is actually right now on domestic extreme sort of right-wing terror groups. And I'm trying to sort of understand how these groups function and what they do and how they operate. And so, this kind of stuff I'm in all sorts of discussion groups where we talk about this stuff. And this is groups of people who are active duty military or intelligence services, people who are in government positions. And so, yes, we share ideas and we try to think through different things. And lots of people disagree. Obviously, there's lots of disagreement about a lot of this stuff. But the way, what an academic community does and the way that scholarship works is over time you build up and you build up and transform our understandings of things. Myself and my colleagues are all sort of part of this ongoing conversation. And we have that conversation. We try to have that conversation with people who engage in policy. So I write pieces. I think now it's entirely online. It used to be an actual newspaper, but there's a newspaper called The Hill, which is in Washington, D.C., which is, it's like the kind of wonky politics newspaper for Congress people and senators read it. And I wrote I write pieces in there. I wrote something about the Ukraine war about a year ago in there. So you try to write in places that you know people who make decisions read. You know, again, it's not that anybody thinks that they're going to have the one idea that ends war or transforms things, right? But you try over time to affect the way that people think about these things. And that's what I do, and that's what my colleagues do.
Plus you also come and talk to us.
Yes.
Very good.
I come talk to groups like this. I give talks all over. There's a Tacoma World Affairs Council, and there's a group out on the eastern side of Washington who does all this stuff. So I also talk to people to help them better understand the world and these things, so they can be part of conversations as well and understand what's happening.
Okay, and there is one last question from Howard, and then we're going to close the comments, and Seth will be here for at least 4.5 more minutes afterwards, and you can talk with him. Could you read the question out and I'll repeat it?
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes.
Okay, if you can, this is Howard. Thank you. I apologize for not being online on screen. My question is this. I'd like to ask you, Professor, if you foresee a time when things will change. And what I'm talking about is the attempt to reunify the USSR. I don't know how far back that goes, but I understand that's what the Ukrainian issue is about. I understand the Israeli-Arab-Palestinian conflict goes back 3,000 or 4,000 years, and the idea of annihilating one of them, annihilating the other. Do you foresee a time when the horrendous effect of war will be considered a no-win and that it'll stop, or do you think the conflict is just forever?
I'll repeat
Oh,
that. Or you want to repeat that?
Are you asking war in general or those specific conflicts?
Either one, your choice.
Okay. So I think the question was, is there ever going to be an end to war? I think I never like to say with certainty anything, because you can't predict the future, and all kinds of crazy things can happen that completely transform the world. But I generally think the answer to that question is no. It's impossible to think about an absence of war, because war is simply, there's a famous Prussian military strategist, Karl von Clausewitz, who wrote that war is the continuation of politics by other means. As long as there are people, we need politics, because we have to figure out how to resolve the differences between us. And as long as there's politics, there's going to be the need to resort to force, right? Conflict is, we know, for example, that chimps engage in something that looks pretty close to war. It's organized. It's not like it's not sort of random, sporadic animal violence. Yeah, right. It's based on territory, and they engage in organized, right? They sort of plan and they go out as an organized unit, and right? It looks very similar to war, right? So I think it is simply part of our nature. We are a contentious people. We are vulnerable, as individuals, and we have differences with each other. And I mean, I think we can see in our own current politics, right? It is really, really hard to live with people who don't look or think like we do. It's a really difficult thing to do. We are now 200 and coming up on 250 years of democracy, and we haven't figured it out right. It is really hard to make the kinds of compromises and do the kinds of things that we need to do in order to live with people who aren't our blood relatives. It's hard enough to live with your blood relatives sometimes, but even harder to live with people who you don't share blood with, and who don't look like you and don't believe the same things you do. And as long as those things are the case, we sometimes will resort to force. So no, I am pessimistic on that front. I don't think war will go away.
Well, that's really a great ending. However, we could talk next week on October 23rd about democracy internationally.
You never stop trying. We just don't think it's going to work.
Thank you again, Professor.
My pleasure.
Weinberger.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me.
Very good. And he will be here for some questions. So thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you again next week and next month.